Chapter 1: The Wrong Sister on the Train. The wedding morning smelled of orange blossom water and scorched coffee, and Hannah Weaver was on her knees at the hem of a veil that was not hers. She had been up since before the rooster, pressing the fine muslin with a flat iron heated on the stove, and now she knelt on the parlor floor working a torn stitch back into the lace while her sister stood above her like something carved for a church niche. Delia Weaver was, everyone agreed, the loveliest girl in 3 counties. The morning light came through the parlor window and found her the way light always seemed to find her, gilding the pale gold of her hair, catching the blue of her eyes, making a small and ordinary farmhouse into a stage with an audience of 1. "Hold still," Hannah murmured around a pin. "You'll have it crooked before the man ever sees it." "There isn't going to be any man," Delia said. Hannah's needle stopped. Their mother, who had been fussing at the buttons on the wedding gown, went very still as well. Their father, in the doorway with his good coat half on, said, "What's that girl?" Delia turned from the mirror. She had the look she wore when she had decided a thing and meant to enjoy telling it. "I said there isn't going to be any man. I've thought and thought about it, and I won't do it. I won't be shipped off across the whole country like a crate of hens to marry some dirt rancher I've never laid eyes on. In Montana. Do you know what Montana is? It's mud and cattle and nothing. I'd sooner die an old maid in a town with a proper church than be buried alive out there." "Delia," their mother's voice climbed. "The passage is paid. The man paid it weeks ago. It's spent." "Then unspend it." "That is not how a thing that is spent works," their father said, and there was real fear under the anger now, the particular fear of a farmer who has counted on money that is already gone. He came into the room. "Girl, we gave a promise, a written promise. There was a photograph sent and a letter signed. Mr. Rourke has arranged for a wife and paid good coin toward it. And a man out there who's paid for a wife and been made a fool of, that man will have things to say. And he'll say them where it does us harm." "Then let him say them to somebody else," Delia said, and she reached up and pulled the half-pinned veil out of Hannah's hands and dropped it on the settee like a thing she was done with. "I'm not going. You can none of you make me get on that train." The silence that followed had weight to it. Hannah stayed where she was on the floor, gathering the fallen veil into her lap out of habit, smoothing it, because someone always had to smooth the things Delia dropped, and it had, for as long as Hannah could remember, always been her. She was 3 years younger than her sister and a whole world plainer, and she had known both those facts the way she knew her own name. Brown hair that would not hold a curl, a face her mother called sensible, which was the kindest word anyone had ever found for it. She was the one who was praised for things, for a mended shirt, a balanced account book, a supper got up out of nearly nothing, and never for herself. When callers came for Delia, Hannah brought the cider and was thanked and forgotten in the same breath. She had made a kind of peace with it, the way a person makes peace with weather. There was no use being sore at the rain for being wet. Her father was pacing now, 3 steps and turn, 3 steps and turn, the way he did over a debt. Her mother had sunk into the chair with the wedding gown crushed across her knees, and she was saying the money, over and over as if the word might bring it back. And then her father stopped pacing. Hannah felt his eyes come to rest on her before she understood why. She looked up from the veil in her lap and found both her parents looking at her, and it was a look she had never once in her life received, a look of consideration, as though she were a coin someone had just discovered in a coat pocket long thought empty. "Hannah," her father said slowly. "No," Delia said and laughed, delight breaking over her face. "Oh no, Papa, you can't mean it." "Why not?" He said it flat, not a question, working it over. "A wife was promised, a wife can be sent." The man's never seen either of them in the flesh. Only the one likeness, and one plain girl looks much like another to a stranger 1,000 miles off. She can cook. She can keep books. He gestured at Hannah, at the veil in her hands, the whole of her. She's good with her hands. She's good for something. "Good for something at last," her mother said, and she said it warmly, gratefully, as though she had paid Hannah a great compliment, and that, more than the rest of it, more than the casual arithmetic of sending one daughter in the place of another, was the thing that lodged in Hannah's chest and sat there like a stone. Good for something at last. As though the whole of her 20 years had been a waiting room, and here at the end of it was the single use they had found for her, to be the thing sent in her sister's place when the beautiful daughter would not go. She ought, she supposed, to have wept, or refused, A girl in a story would have flown up in a rage and named the injustice of it aloud. But Hannah Weaver had never once in her life been needed, and she was so bone-tired of being no one's first choice that even being chosen only because the true choice had walked away, struck her, in that strange, stilled moment, as something she could not quite bring herself to turn down. "When does the train go?" she asked. Her father blinked. "Noon." "From the depot." Hannah looked down at the veil, the pretty foolish thing she had mended for a wedding that would not be Delia's after all, and she set it aside on the settee, folded, the way you leave a thing you are finished with. "Then someone had best help me pack the trunk," she said, and got up off the floor. They did not, in the end, help her pack the trunk. Her mother wept the useful sort of tears that require attending to, and Delia had already drifted back to the mirror to admire the disaster she'd made. And so Hannah packed it herself, as she had known she would her 2 good dresses and her 1 better one, her sewing kit, her mother's receipt book that no one else could read the hand of, a comb, a Bible, a pair of stockings darned so often they were more darn than stocking. The trunk was not heavy, that was the part that stayed with her, a whole life, and it did not fill a trunk. At the depot, the noon sun stood white and flat over the platform, and the train breathed its great slow breaths beside them, and her family gathered in a loose knot to see the wrong sister off. Her father pressed the ticket and a folded paper into her hands. The letter, Mr. Rourke's letter, the terms of the thing written in a square, blunt hand, and told her to give it to the man plain and let the man decide, and by the set of his shoulders Hannah understood he did not expect the man to keep her. Her mother kissed her cheek and said be a good girl and did not say I am sorry, because she was not truly. She was only relieved, and relief was already smoothing the trouble out of her face. And Delia, restored to her comfort, radiant now that the danger of Montana had passed to somebody else, leaned in with the ghost of a laugh still on her, and touched Hannah's plain sleeve and said, "Do try not to embarrass us." It landed the way such things always landed from her sister, lightly, carelessly, a pebble tossed without a thought for where it struck. And Hannah stood with her trunk at her feet and her ticket in her glove and felt it strike, and understood that this was the whole of her farewell. Not you will be missed, not God keep you, but a warning that whatever she was about to be, she should be sure to be it quietly, so as to reflect no poorly on the ones who had sent her. "I'll do my best," Hannah said, "to be no trouble to you at all." And if there was an edge under the mildness of it, none of them was listening close enough to hear it. Then the conductor called, and she climbed the iron steps alone, and found a seat by the window on the side that faced away from them, so she would not have to watch them turn for home before the train had even pulled clear. The country unspooled westward for 4 days. Hannah sat with the letter in her lap, and when the fields gave over to grass, and the grass to a vastness she had no name for, she did the only thing she knew to do with a hard road, which was to walk out ahead of it in her mind, so nothing could take her by surprise. She was not a fool. She knew what waited at the end of the line. A man had paid for a beauty and had a photograph of one, and what would step down off the stage was Hannah, dust-colored and sensible, plainly not the girl in the likeness. She rehearsed his face, the double take of it, the way his eyes would go from the photograph to her and back and settle into the flat courtesy men used when they meant to be rid of you without a scene. She built the rejection stone by stone so that when it came it would fit an expectation instead of an open wound. He would send her back, of course he would send her back. A man who had been made a fool of would not compound it by keeping the fool's consolation prize. He would put her on the next eastbound stage like unwanted goods returned to the merchant, and she would ride home to a house that had already forgotten it had ever needed her, and take up the veil mending and the account books and the bringing of cider again, and that would be that. She told herself this until the telling wore smooth. She told herself she hoped for nothing, because hope was a luxury that had never once been repaid to her, and a person could not lose what she had refused from the start to hold. Somewhere in the second night, with her forehead against the cold black glass and the whole dark rolling country pouring past, she made herself a small hard promise, the only kind she trusted. She would not grovel. Whatever the man was, however he looked at her, she would tell him the plain truth of who she was and who she was not, and she would offer to take herself back east before he could have the satisfaction of sending her. She had been passed over her whole life by people who loved her. She could surely bear being passed over once more by a stranger who did not. The train ran on toward Montana, and the wrong sister rode inside it, braced against a rejection she was as certain of as sunrise, and entirely unaware that the man at the end of the line valued a straight word above a pretty face, and was about to find, stepping down onto his dusty platform, the truest thing the Weavers had ever sent him. Chapter 2, Not the Face He Paid For. Caleb Rourke had shaved that morning for the first time in a week, and he felt foolish for it. He stood on the plank walk outside the stage office in Miller's Bend with his hat in one hand and a letter folded soft as cloth in the breast pocket of his good coat, and he watched the road where it bent through the cottonwoods and threw up a haze of yellow dust that meant the coach was late but coming. The letter had been read so many times the creases had gone to felt. He did not need to take it out to know what it said. Miss Delia Weaver of the Weaver farm outside Council Grove was pleased to accept his offer and would arrive on the spring stage. There had been a photograph folded inside it once, a woman with a bright, careful face and her hair done in a way that told a man she knew she was worth the trouble of looking at. "You keep working that hat brim," old Pete said from the bench behind him. "You'll wear clean through." "I'm not working it. You've turned it 3 times since the church bell." Pete spat into the street and leaned back against the boards, all leather and gray whiskers and a grin he was not troubling to hide. "Man waits 4 years to take another wife. He's allowed to fret. I just didn't reckon I'd live to see Caleb Rourke fret over a woman he ain't met." "I'm not fretting." "No," Pete agreed pleasantly. "You shaved for the weather." Caleb almost smiled, and that surprised him more than the shaving had. He had not expected to feel anything but the flat weight of a thing decided. He was 34 years old, a widower with a good stretch of grass and a bad stretch of memory, and he had written for a wife the way a man wrote for seed or a new plow, because the ranch needed one and his own heart had gone quiet on the matter of choosing. He had not looked for love. He had looked for a partner who would not run at the sight of a hard winter. That the woman coming was, by her likeness, a beauty, he had counted as neither here nor there. A pretty face did not mend fence, but he would be lying if he said the photograph had not sat in his coat all week like a coal he kept meaning to put out. Then the stage came round the bend, and the 6 horses slowed, and the driver hauled them down in a long grinding of brake and a rolling wall of dust, and the whole idle length of Miller's Bend turned to watch a man get his mail-order bride. The door opened. A drummer climbed down first, then a woman in black who was somebody's aunt, and Caleb's chest had gone tight in a way he despised. Then a third stepped down and set her own boot to the iron step because no one had thought to hand her and stood. She was not the photograph. She was smaller than the bright woman in the likeness and browner from the road, and her traveling dress had been a good gray once and was now the color of everything the trip had passed through. Her hair was pinned plain and coming loose at one temple. Her face was, plain was the word, and Caleb was not a man to reach for a kinder one when the true one would do. Not homely. Just a face a body's eyes would pass over in a crowd and not think to come back to. She stood with her carpet bag held in both hands in front of her like a shield, and she looked at him, and he watched her read his face and find in it exactly what he was ashamed, a half-second later, to know had been there. He had taken the photograph half out of his pocket without deciding to. He looked at the bright, careful woman on the paper, and he looked at the dusty woman on the walk, and he did not need to say a word, because the whole crowd said it for him in a low run of murmur that moved down the boards like wind through wheat. "That ain't the one from the picture," somebody said, not quiet enough. Caleb put the photograph away. The woman saw him do it. Something in her went very straight and very still, the way a person stands when they have decided not to flinch. She crossed the few feet of plank between them, and up close her eyes were a clear, steady hazel and not plain at all, and she spoke low, for him and not for the street. "You're Mr. Rourke." "I am." "You were expecting my sister." She said it flat, without a tremble, getting there before he could, taking the blow into her own hands so no one else could swing it. "Delia, you wrote for Delia, and you're looking at me trying to make the 2 of us into one person, and it can't be done, so I'll spare you the arithmetic. She wouldn't come. She changed her mind on the wedding morning. I'm Hannah, the other Weaver girl. I came in her place because the passage was paid and a promise had been made and somebody had to keep it." She drew a breath, and only in the drawing of it did he hear what it cost her. "I know I'm not what you paid for. I'll not stand here and pretend otherwise, and I'll not ask you to. There's a stage back east Thursday. You needn't say the words out loud. I can see them well enough." For a moment, Caleb Rourke could not find anything at all to say. He was aware of Pete off his bench and standing. He was aware of the crowd leaning. He was aware, mostly, of this small, dust-colored woman who had just walked 1,100 miles to be rejected, and had squared up to take it standing rather than let it be done to her sideways. He had spent 4 years around men who would spend an hour talking around the edge of a plain thing rather than set it on the table. She had set the whole ugly business on the table in under a minute, and put her own 2 hands flat on either side of it. "You always tell a man the worst of it first?" he asked. She blinked. It was not the answer she had braced for. "It saves time," she said, "and it's the truth. I've found the truth's the one thing nobody can take back off you later." Behind Caleb, old Pete made a low sound that in a less dignified man would have been a laugh. Caleb looked at her a long moment. He thought of the letter gone soft in his pocket, and the word he had given in it, plain black ink, a weaver to marry a Rourke, and he thought that a man's word did not go looking for loopholes in the fine print of which sister showed up to hold up her end of it. She had come. She had come the whole hard way when the one he'd chosen had not come at all. That counted for something in the ledger Caleb kept, and it counted for more than the arithmetic of a face. "You'll not be getting on Thursday's stage," he said. She went still again, differently this time. "I don't say it to be kind," he went on, because he would not have her thinking herself pitied. He could see already that pity would wound her worse than plain dealing. "I say it because I'm not in the habit of standing a woman up on a public street for the crime of being honest with me. You came. That's more than was done by the one I wrote for. We'll go on to the ranch, and we'll talk it square where 40 people aren't leaning into here, and we'll see what's to be done. That suits you." Hannah Weaver looked up at him with an expression he could not read at all, which was rare. He read stock and weather and men for a living. Then she nodded once tight and did not trust herself to more. "Pete," Caleb said. "Her trunk." The wagon ride out took the better part of 2 hours, and for most of it neither of them said much. The land opened as they left the town, grass going silver-green to the foot of the mountains, the sky enormous and clean, and Caleb watched her out of the side of his eye watch it, and saw her carpetbag come, by slow degrees, to rest in her lap instead of clutched against her. It was the mare that broke the silence. Bess had gone lame 2 weeks back, and Caleb had put her in the traces easy alongside the young gelding rather than leave her to fret in the corral, and coming up the long grade she began to favor the off hind and blow. "She's short on that leg," Hannah said. "She's old." "She's short because she's carrying it wrong to spare the frog." Hannah nodded at the mare without any show, the way a person names a thing they simply know. "There's a stone bruise or a bit of gravel packed up under, likely on the inside where you'd not think to look. Poultice of bran and hot water overnight draws it. My father kept mules he'd sooner see fed than his daughters, but I learned their feet." She said the last part lightly, and it landed anything but. Caleb said nothing, but he filed it away, the whole of it, the feet and the father's both, and something in him that had been braced all morning for disappointment eased back a notch it had not known it was holding. They came up to the house at the gold end of the afternoon, low and long and grayer than it ought to have been for want of a woman's hand, or any hand at all these 4 years. Caleb reined in and let her look at it. "I'll say it plain," he told her, because plain was what she'd given him and he meant to return the coin, "since plain seems to be the currency between us. I didn't write for love. I wrote for a partner and a wife to a ranch that needs one, and grief made me a poor bargain besides. So here's the shape of it, and you can take it or take Thursday's stage after all, no shame in it either way. There's the marriage on paper, the license, the promise kept. My name to yours so no soul in that town can call you cast off. There's a room of your own, and mine's the other end of the house, and I'll not so much as darken your door. We'll call it a season's trial. You owe me nothing you don't care to give, and I'll ask nothing I've no right to. Come spring, if it doesn't answer, you go home whole and provided for. Fair." Hannah looked at the tired gray house a long moment, and Caleb had the strange sense she was seeing something in it he couldn't. "Fair," she said. That night she carried her own trunk to the room at the near end of the hall, and unpacked it alone by the light of one candle, the 2 spare dresses, the sewing box, the small worn Bible with her name written under her sister's in a hand that had pressed harder on the first name than the second. She set them on the shelf and told herself, the way she had told herself the whole long way west, that it was only for a season, that this was a place she was passing through, that a woman braced to be sent home should not go making a home of a house she'd been let into on paper. Down the hall she could hear the rancher moving, and then not moving, and the whole big country quiet outside the walls. She blew out the candle. She did not let herself hope. But she lay a long time in the dark listening to a house that had, for the first time in her life, a room in it that was hers. Chapter 3. Earning the ground she stands on. Hannah woke before the light, the way she always had, the way a body learns when no one has ever thought to let it sleep in. For a moment she did not know where she was. The bed was strange, the dark a shape she did not recognize, no low farmhouse rafters, no Delia breathing soft and untroubled across the room. Then the cold came back and the memory with it, the train, the dusty street, the man who had looked at the photograph in his hand and then at her face and gone very still. Caleb Rourke, her husband on paper and nothing else. A trial season, he had said in that flat, careful voice. Separate rooms, no promises. She lay a moment longer, listening to the house. It was a silent, unloved quiet, the quiet of a place where a man ate standing up and let the dust settle where it liked. She had heard that quiet all her life in other people. She knew what it wanted. So she got up. The kitchen was worse by daylight than it had been by lamp the night before. Ashes banked cold in the stove. A tin of coffee gone stale. Flour with weevil in the top of it, which she skimmed and sifted without complaint, because complaining had never once in her life made a thing better. She built the fire. She scoured the table down to its honest grain. She found a crock of sourdough gone sullen from neglect and coaxed it awake with warm water and patience, the way her grandmother had taught her, back when being useful was the only coin Hannah Weaver had to spend. By the time the window went gray, then gold, bread was rising under a cloth, and the whole cold room smelled of yeast and wood smoke and something like living. She found the ledgers, too. They were on a shelf by the door, 3 of them their spines cracked, and she opened them only to move them from where they would be splashed by the wash water. But her eye caught on a column, and her eye had never in its life been able to leave a wrong column alone. Someone had added a season of feed costs twice and carried the error forward through 4 months, so that the ranch on paper looked to be bleeding money it had never actually spent. She sat down. She found a pencil worn to a nub. And because it was easier than leaving it, she began quietly to set it right. That was how Caleb found her. She heard his boots on the porch and did not startle, though her heart did. He came in with the gray morning cold coming off his coat, and he stopped just inside the door. He looked at the fire. He looked at the scrubbed table and the bread under its cloth and the coffee she had set to keep warm at the back of the stove. He looked at the ledger open under her hand and the pencil in her fingers. "You've been in my books," he said, not angry. She could not tell what it was. "You paid feed twice in the fall accounts," Hannah said. She did not apologize. Apologizing, she had learned, only told a man he had a right to be owed one. "Carried it 4 months. You're $40 less poor than you thought you were. I'd have asked, but you were asleep and it was bothering me." For a long moment Caleb Rourke said nothing at all. Then something moved at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, but was in the same country as one. $40, he said. "And there's a subtraction on the far page I'd not swear my life on either." She closed the book. "The coffee's fresh. The last was a crime against God and man." He crossed the room and poured himself a cup and drank it standing, watching her over the rim the way a man watches whether he has not decided about. But he drank 2 cups, and when she set bread and salt pork in front of him, he ate like a man who had forgotten food could be given rather than merely taken, and at the end of it he said, gruff, to the plate more than to her, "It's good." It was not much. Hannah had gone whole years on less. She turned to the stove so he would not see what 2 small words could do to a face that had trained itself so long against hoping. The days took a shape after that. She staked out a garden plot on the south side where the frost would leave first, and turned the sod herself when Caleb was out with the herd, and had blisters she wrapped in rag and mentioned to no one. She mended the corral gate that had been tied shut with wire since before her time. She learned the house's tempers, which board complained, which windows stuck, where the wind found its way in, and gentled them one by one, the way you gentle anything left too long alone. And over the meals, slow as a thaw, they began to talk. It was nothing at first, the weather. The mare, for she had been right about the mare's favored leg, and Caleb had packed the hoof as she said, and the swelling had gone down, and he told her so plainly, as a man reports a debt. But talk runs downhill once it starts, and Hannah, it turned out, was funny, in the dry, unshowy way of a woman who has spent her life watching from the edge of rooms, and learning how ridiculous the people at the center of them can be. "My sister," she said once, without bitterness, only telling it, once wept for 3 days because a man wrote her a poem comparing her to the dawn. She thought it insufficient. She'd expected the noon. And Caleb Rourke, hard-worn widower who had not, by Pete's account, laughed aloud in 2 years, put down his fork and laughed, a short, rusty, astonished sound, as if it had gotten out of him before he could stop it. He looked almost as surprised by it as she was. Old Pete was a harder ground to break. He watched her the first week the way a dog watches a stranger near the door, not snapping, but not fooled. She understood it and did not press. She had learned early that some loyalties are grief wearing its work clothes, and Pete's grief had a name. It was over the stove that she found her way in. There was a blue enamel coffee pot she had not used, and one evening she asked him about it, plainly, the way she asked about everything. "That be Miss Ruth's," Pete said, and his jaw set. "Caleb's first wife, God rest her." Another woman might have quietly put the pot away where it would not remind anyone, wanted the house scrubbed clean of the woman who had it first. But Hannah had grown up second to someone. She knew how it felt to be swept out of sight for the comfort of others, and she would not do it to a dead woman who could not defend her own memory. "Then it stays where she kept it," Hannah said. "Show me where. I'll not move her things about like she was nobody." She paused. "What was she like? I'd rather know her than pretend her away." Pete looked at her a long, long moment. Something in the old man's weathered face came loose. "She sang," he said at last roughly, "off-key. All day?" And he told her, haltingly then not haltingly at all, about Ruth Rourke who had planted the lilac by the well and never once let a hand go hungry. And Hannah listened, and did not compete with a ghost, and by the end of it Pete was calling her ma'am in a voice that had stopped meaning it as offense. They drove to town on the Saturday, for nails and salt and thread. Mrs. Abernathy, who kept the mercantile with her sleeves pushed up and an opinion on everything, took to Hannah at once, a warmth so plain and unearned that Hannah did not, for a moment, know what to do with it. "You've a sensible face," the woman declared, weighing out coffee. "Do you know how rare a sensible face is? Half this town would walk into the creek to admire itself." And she pressed a paper of licorice into Hannah's hand and would not take the penny for it. It was by the flour barrels that Hannah heard the other kind of talk. Two women bonnets together. "Rourke's bride, they say. That, I heard she was a beauty. Well, he got the plain one, poor man, sent all that money east and got the plain one." Hannah kept her eyes on the shelf of thread and chose her color with great care, and her face did not change, because her face had had practice. She had heard worse across her own family's dinner table, said louder by people who owed her more. It could not cut what was already scarred. But when she turned, Caleb was in the doorway, and by the flat still set of him she knew he had heard it too. He did not make a scene, he was not a scene-making man. He only crossed to her and took the parcels from her arms though she had not asked, and said, quite clearly to the whole listening store, "You ready, Mrs. Rourke?" and walked her out with his hand at the small of her back like she was worth guarding. She did not know what to do with that either. The smooth man found them by the wagon. He came across the street with his hat already lifting, a landowner's easy, prosperous smile, and put out his hand to Caleb. "Rourke. And this must be the new Mrs. Rourke." Silas Crane, he named himself, neighbor to the north, and his eyes went over Hannah once, a quick appraising flick, doing sums, before returning to Caleb full of a sympathy that fooled no one it was aimed at. "I'll confess I'd heard," Crane said, low and confiding and just loud enough. "You were expecting someone rather more, as advertised. Hard luck that. A man pays for the picture." He shook his head as though at a shared misfortune. "Say the word, you know, and I'd still buy that creek section off you, ease the disappointment some. Sorry business all around." Caleb looked at the offered pity, the way he might look at a coyote in the yard. "My creek's not for sale," he said. "And there's no disappointment on this wagon but the one you brought with you." He handed Hannah up to the seat himself. "Good day, Crane." They rode a while in silence, out past the last fences, the mountains going blue ahead of them. Hannah watched the country open and did not trust the small, warm thing turning over under her ribs, because she had trusted such things before. "You didn't have to," she said finally. "In the store and with him." Caleb kept his eyes on the road. "Man says true words or he keeps his mouth shut," he said. "I don't hold with the third thing, which is saying kind lies. What I said was true." That was all, but it was a great deal. That night she heard his boots stop outside her door. She lay very still in the dark. The bread was set to rise for morning, the ledger was squared, the house breathed easier than it had in years, and she had made it do so with her own two overlooked hands. She heard him standing there, one breath, two, a man at the edge of a thing, deciding. Then the boots went on down the hall, and his own door closed, and the house was quiet again. Hannah stared at the ceiling in the dark, and against every hard-won lesson of her life, against all the good sense that had kept her safe by keeping her small, she let herself feel it. The smallest, most dangerous flicker of hope, lit and cupped against the wind, that she might get to stay. Chapter 4, The Weight of a Given Word. The storm came down out of the north, the way trouble always came to Montana, without knocking, and with the whole house shaking on its bones. Hannah had known it was coming since noon. The chickens had gone to roost early, and the light over the mountains had turned the sick green of a bruise. She had lived on a farm long enough to read the sky, and she had spent the afternoon bringing in the wash, banking the fire, and setting a lantern by the door where a body could find it in a hurry. She was drying her hands on her apron when Caleb came through that door with the wind, and the wind nearly took the door off him. Fence is down in the west section. He had to raise his voice over the roar of it. Rain sheeted off the brim of his hat and ran black down his oilskin. Whole stretch of it. Cattle are drifting with the wind, and the wind's carrying them straight toward Crane's line. How many? 40 head, maybe 50. His jaw was set hard. Pete's already saddled. If they cross onto Crane's ground tonight, we'll spend a month and a lawyer's fee getting them back, and we may not get them at all. Hannah was already reaching for her shawl, and then, thinking better of it, for the heavy coat that had belonged to nobody and hung spare by the door. Then we'd best not let them cross. Caleb stopped. Water dripped from him onto the clean floor, and he did not seem to notice it. You don't have to come out in this. No, she agreed, buttoning the coat to her chin. I don't. She took the lantern off its hook. Where do you want me? He looked at her a moment longer than the weather allowed for, a plain woman in a man's coat 3 sizes too big, her chin up, her hands steady on the lantern, and something moved behind his eyes that she did not have time to name. Come on, then, was all he said, but he held the door for her against the wind. The dark outside was total and living. The rain did not fall so much as fly, driven flat and stinging, and the mud sucked at her boots. Old Pete had 3 horses saddled in the aisle, and when he saw her come in behind Caleb, his grizzled brows went up under his hat. You bring in the missus. I'm bringing myself, Hannah said before Caleb could answer. Which of these is gentle? Pete stared at her. Then something like a grin cracked his weathered face, gone as fast as it came. The bay, she's got sense, which is more'n I can say for the rest of us tonight. He tossed her the reins. You ride. I was raised on a farm, Mr. Pete. I rode before I walked proper. She swung up, and if the wet skirts fought her, she did not let them win, and she gathered the bay under her like she meant it. Pete looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at nothing and mounted and led them out into the storm. The next hours came to Hannah afterward in pieces, the lantern hissing and refusing to die because she cupped her whole body around it, the white eyes of the cattle rolling in the dark, the steaming press of them. Caleb's voice, low and even, gentling the herd the way another man might gentle a frightened child, never sharp, a wall of calm against the panic. Pete cursing joyfully at a heifer that would not be turned. The cold that got into her hands until she could not feel the lantern's bale. She learned the work by doing it. When Caleb needed light thrown ahead to find the broken run of wire, she was there with it, holding it high though her arms shook. When a steer bolted back toward the gap, she wheeled the bay across its path without being told, and the animal thought better of it, and she heard Pete whoop somewhere in the dark. When Caleb dismounted to haul the fallen rails and lash a rope across the gap, she was down in the mud beside him, her hands next to his on the cold, wet rope. You'll ruin that coat, Caleb said, close to her ear so she'd hear it. It wasn't mine to start with. She dug her heels in and pulled, and a coat can be scrubbed. They got the gap closed near enough to hold. They got the cattle turned and drifting the right way, back down into the sheltered draw where the wind couldn't reach them and the willows broke the rain. By the time the last of them was gathered, the storm had blown itself ragged and thin, and a hard gray light was leaking up in the east, and Hannah was so cold and tired she could not have said her own name if a stranger asked it. But she had not been sent home. She had been needed, and she had answered, and the thing she had done had worked. It sat strange and warm in her chest, that knowing. Pete took the first watch on the herd. Caleb took Hannah back to the line shack at the head of the draw, a low sod-roofed place with a stove, and he built the fire up while she stood dripping in the middle of the floor, and then he took the wet coat off her shoulders himself before she thought to, and wrapped a dry wool blanket around her instead. "Sit," he said. "By the fire, that's an order if you'll take one." She sat, the heat came into her by degrees, and with it the ache of every muscle she owned. Caleb crouched to feed the stove, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, and the silence was not the cold sort she had grown up inside. It was the other kind. "You did a night's work out there," he said at last, low to the fire. "A hand's work. Better than some hands I've paid." "I'm useful," Hannah said. "It's the one thing I've always been good for." She said it plainly, without heat, the way she said everything, but Caleb turned his head and looked at her, and she wished, too late, she had held her tongue. "Who taught you to say it like that?" he asked. "Like it's a small thing." She looked into the stove. It was easier than looking at him. "My family, Delia was the beauty. I was the one who could mend the veil and pack the trunk and get the beauty onto the train." She lifted one shoulder. "I've spent my whole life being second, Mr. Rourke. I came out here because being wanted for a bargain was still more than I'd been wanted for before. I expect nothing. It's easier that way." "You expect nothing, and you can't be sent home from it." She had not meant to say so much. The cold and the tiredness had loosened something in her that she usually kept latched tight. Caleb was quiet a long moment. Then he sat down on the floor near her, his back against the wood box, and he looked into the same fire she was looking into, and he told her about Sarah. He did not tell it easily. He told it the way a man crosses a river he'd rather not deliberate, watching his footing. How his first wife had died 2 winters back, the fever taking her in a week, and how he had buried her under the cottonwood on the rise and had not since wanted anything for himself, because wanting was how a man got a hole burned through him. How he had sent east for a wife the way a man buys seed, meaning a bargain and nothing more, because a bargain could not break your heart. "So you see," he said, "I didn't come to that stage stop wanting a beauty either. I came wanting an arrangement, something a man could hold at arm's length." He turned the split of pine over in his hands. "I'm telling you because you told me true, and you ought to have true back." The fire popped. Outside, the last of the rain ticked on the sod roof and stopped. "I'm sorry for your Sarah," Hannah said softly. "I'd not want you to put her aside. A man who could forget the first one wouldn't be worth the keeping of the second." Caleb looked at her then, really looked, the way he had in the barn, and did not look away. Dawn brought Crane. He rode up the draw just as the sun cleared the ridge, 2 of his men behind him, a smile stitched onto his handsome face. "Rourke," he touched his hat. "Rough night, heard your fence gave." His eyes moved over the cattle, counting, and over Hannah in her mud-caked skirts, and the smile widened by a hair. "By my reckoning, a fair few of these crossed onto my ground before you turned them. Frontier custom being what it is, strays that come onto a man's land come to belong to him. But the law's the law out here, and it's mostly what a man's willing to stand on." Caleb came up out of his crouch by the herd. He did not hurry. He walked to stand at his horse's head, and he settled his hat, and he looked up at Crane on his fine, tall horse with an expression that had gone entirely still. "Not one of them crossed your line, Crane." His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "I was out in it all night, and so was my wife, and so was Pete, and we turned them in the draw, which is my ground to the willows, and passed. You know it's my ground. You've known it since your daddy ran cattle here." He paused. "You want to stand on the law, we'll stand on it in town in front of a judge with a map. Till then you'll ride off my land the way you rode on." For a long moment the 2 men held each other's eyes. It was Crane who looked away first with a laugh and a shrug, as though it had all been in fun. "No call to be hard about it, neighbor. A man asks is all." He wheeled his horse. "My regards to the missus." And the pause he put around the word was its own small insult, and then he was gone down the draw with his men. Hannah let out a breath she had not known she was holding. What she had watched was a man's given word made into something a body could lean on, immovable as the mountains behind him. And she understood all at once that he had made that wall of himself for her sake as much as the cattle's. Caleb crossed to her through the wet grass. There was mud drying on her cheek, a streak of it from the night's work she hadn't washed away, and without a word he lifted his thumb and wiped it clean, gentle as anything, his rough hand warm against her cold face. "The Weavers," he said low, so only she would hear it, "sent the wrong sister to be ashamed of." Hannah's breath caught in her throat and would not come loose. He meant it as praise. She saw that he meant it, saw it plain in the tired steadiness of his eyes, and it undid something in her that a lifetime of being second had bricked up tight. "We'd best get you warm." was all he said, and dropped his hand and turned toward the horses. But that afternoon, without either of them making a speech of it, Caleb carried her trunk from the cold spare room across the hall to the sunny one that shared a wall with his own. He set it down and looked at her. "Closer's warmer," he said gruffly, "come winter." "It is," Hannah agreed, and did not trust herself to say more, and did not need to. It was not a bargain any longer, whatever the paper said. Both of them knew it now, and neither of them said it, and the not saying was its own quiet vow. Chapter 5, The Space Between Two Rooms. The mornings had changed, and Hannah had not decided yet whether that frightened her more than the cold ones before. She noticed it in small things. The way Caleb no longer waited for her to set his coffee down before he spoke, but reached for the cup while it was still in her hand, his fingers brushing hers as if by accident that was not, quite, an accident. The way he lingered at the table after he'd eaten instead of shrugging into his coat and vanishing into the gray. The way the house, which had felt like borrowed shelter her first weeks, had begun to feel like a place she was allowed to stand in without apologizing for it. "You're holding the reins like you mean to strangle her," Caleb said. They were in the near paddock, the frost not yet burned off the grass, and Hannah sat astride the gentle bay mare he'd picked for her with more care than he'd admit. She loosened her grip, and the mare's ears eased. "I was taught a lady rides side saddle," she said, "or not at all." "You were taught a great many foolish things." He came alongside, one hand resting on the mare's neck. "Out here a woman who can't sit a horse proper is a woman waiting on somebody to fetch her. You don't strike me as the waiting kind." The praise was so plain and so unbothered that Hannah had to look away to keep her face from betraying her. A month ago she'd have counted the compliment and turned it over for the trick in it. Now she only felt the warmth of it settle somewhere under her ribs. "Heels down," he said. "Sit into her. She'll go where you look, so quit looking at the ground like you're planning to land there." She laughed before she could stop herself, and the sound surprised them both. Caleb's mouth curved, that slow, reluctant thing that was not quite a smile but was reaching for one, and he stepped back and clicked his tongue, and the mare walked on, and Hannah did not fall. By the time the sun had cleared the ridge, she was trotting the fence line, graceless and grinning, and Caleb leaned on the rail watching her with an expression old Pete would later describe, uncharitably and accurately, as that of a man who'd been struck over the head and found he liked it. She paid him back in the kitchen, where her sovereignty was absolute. "That is not how you fold it," she said that evening, catching his big hands mid-crime over the biscuit dough. "You're kneading it like you're breaking a horse. Gentle. My mother would have rapped your knuckles." "Your mother sounds a fearsome woman." She was fearsome about the wrong things. Hannah guided his hands, folding rather than pressing, and did not remark on how still he went when her fingers closed over his. Buttermilk and a light touch, that's the whole secret. She guarded it like gold, and it was only ever kindness to the dough. "And she taught it to you." "She taught it to Delia." Hannah kept her voice even, scraping flour from the board. "I learned it standing behind her, watching. Most things I know I learned that way." Caleb was quiet a moment. Then low, "Then she taught the wrong daughter, and the right one learned anyhow." Hannah's hands stilled on the board. She did not look up, because if she looked up he would see, and she was not ready for him to see. "The biscuits will burn," she said, "if you keep talking sweet and letting the oven go cold." But she was smiling when she bent to the fire, and he saw that too. The town social came the following Saturday, and Hannah dreaded it the way she'd once dreaded the schoolroom. "I've nothing fit," she told Mrs. Abernathy in the mercantile low, so the two women fingering ribbon near the window wouldn't hear. "And I'll not have him ashamed to stand near me in front of the whole county." "Child," Mrs. Abernathy set down her ledger with the finality of a woman about to say her piece. "You've a blue wool that's clean and pressed and cut to your figure, and that's more than half the finery in this town can claim. And Caleb Rourke will not be ashamed. You mark me. That man has not so much as tipped his hat at a woman in 3 years, and now he can't cross the street without walking you to the other side of it." Hannah shook her head, an old reflex. "He's a decent man doing a decent thing. He's a man who came in here Tuesday and bought a length of blue ribbon the exact shade of a dress he'd have no reason to know the color of, unless he'd been studying it." Mrs. Abernathy reached beneath the counter and produced it, coiled neat, and pressed it into Hannah's hand before she could refuse. "He asked me to give it you and not say where it came from. So I've done half of what he asked, which is my usual portion of obedience. Now go home and put it in your hair." She wore the ribbon. The social was held in the church hall with the pews pushed back and a fiddler sweating in the corner, and Hannah stepped through the door braced for the murmur, the flick of eyes, the whisper of "got the plain one" that had followed her since the stage. She heard the beginning of it, a knot of women by the cider, a head turning, and then Caleb's hand settled at the small of her back, warm and broad and entirely unhurried, and the murmur died in the women's throats. He did not leave her side the whole of the night. He was not a graceful dancer. He was too big and too careful, and he counted the steps under his breath in a way that made her want to laugh, and he stepped on her hem twice and apologized both times as gravely as if he'd wounded her. But he danced every dance with her and no one else, and when Silas Crane's cousin ventured to ask whether Mrs. Rourke might favor him a reel, Caleb said, "She might not," in a voice pleasant enough and final enough that the man found somewhere else to be. "You're making a spectacle," Hannah whispered, breathless, as the fiddle wheeled them past the cider table. "I'm making a point," he said. "There's a difference, though I'll grant you they look alike from the outside." She understood the point, so did everyone in the hall. By the time the fiddler laid down his bow, the whispers had turned, and what they'd turned into was worse and better than scorn. It was envy, thin and astonished, the whole county watching Caleb Rourke look at his plain wife as though she were the only lit window on a dark road. He walked her home under a moon so bright it threw shadows. The wagon rolled slow, the horses knowing the way, and for a long stretch neither of them spoke. The night smelled of cut hay and cold sage. Hannah pulled her shawl close and was acutely, painfully aware of the 6 inches of seat between them, and of how, at the last turn, they had somehow become 3 inches. "Hannah," he said her name like he was testing the weight of it. "When I wrote back east for a wife, I wasn't looking for—" He stopped. His jaw worked, the reins hung loose in his hands. "My first wife, Sarah. When I lost her, I told myself I was done wanting anything that could be taken. It's a coward's peace, but it's a peace. You learn to want nothing and you can't be robbed." Hannah's heart had begun to beat somewhere up in her throat. Caleb. "And then you came." He was looking at the road, not at her, as though the words could only be got out sideways. "You came and you weren't what I sent for, and you were—" Again he stopped. The wagon rolled. The moon poured down white and merciless over a man reaching for the edge of a thing he'd sworn never to touch again. "You were the first thing in 3 years I've been afraid to lose," he said. The wagon came to the yard. The house stood dark and waiting. He set the brake and turned to her, and she saw it in his face, the near word, the almost, his hand lifting as if to touch her cheek the way he'd touched it in the mud and the firelight, that night that had changed everything and named nothing. And then the old fear closed over him like water. She watched it happen, watched him remember what wanting had cost him before, watched him pull the wanting back behind his teeth. "It's late," he said gruff. "You'll take a chill." He handed her down. He did not touch her cheek. At the threshold he stopped as he always stopped in the space between her door and his, and Hannah stood in the dark listening to his boots go the other way and dared, foolishly, against every lesson of her life, to hope. What Hannah did not know, could not know, was that a second letter had left the county that week besides her own. Silas Crane had watched the social from the edge of the hall with a smile that never reached his eyes. He had watched Rourke's hand at the plain woman's back and done his arithmetic. A devoted man was a man with a weakness, and a prosperous man's weakness was worth writing east about. He had gone home and dipped his pen and addressed an envelope to a family named Weaver, in a town he'd had to ask Hannah's own maiden name to learn, and in it he had painted with generous strokes the fine ranch, the fat herd, the good water, and the curious fact that the rancher who'd paid for the beautiful sister seemed uncommonly attached to the plain one who'd come instead. He mailed it Monday. He did not sign it kindly. Hannah wrote her own letter that same week, at the kitchen table, by lamplight, after Caleb had gone up. She had not written home in earnest since she'd come. Her first letters had been dutiful and dry, reporting safe arrival the way one reports weather. But tonight the ribbon was still in her hair, and the memory of his hand at her back was still warm, and the word he had not quite said hung in the house like the smell of bread, and she could not hold it in alone any longer. "Dear Mother," she wrote, and then sat a while and then wrote the truth. "I am happy. I did not expect to be, and I am almost afraid to write it down, as though saying so will call the bad luck home. But he is a good man, better than the bargain that brought me, and he is kind to me in ways no one has troubled to be before. I ride now. I keep his books. There is a woman in town who is my friend. Last Saturday he danced with no one but me in front of everyone, and I hardly know how to say it, I think he may come to care for me. Truly. Not because I am useful, because I am me. She read it over. It was too much. It gave too much away. Her whole exposed heart lay there on the page for the reading. A wiser woman, a woman who had been chosen more than once in her life, might have hidden more. But Hannah Weaver had been happy so rarely that she did not yet know how to be quiet about it. She folded the letter. She sealed it with a drop of wax and pressed it flat, and she smiled at it and set it on the shelf by the door to go into town with the Tuesday mail, never once imagining what such a letter, read by the wrong eyes at the wrong table 1,000 miles east, might bring west again in its place. Chapter 6. A Letter Draws the Wolves. The morning came in soft and gold over the eastern ridge, and Hannah stood at the kitchen window with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she had not yet drunk, watching Caleb cross the yard with his hat pushed back and the low sun on his face. There was a lightness in him lately that she had learned to read the way she read whether the set of his shoulders looser, the corners of his mouth quicker to give. He caught her looking through the glass, and instead of glancing away as a lesser man might, he held her eyes and touched 2 fingers to the brim of his hat, grave as a courtship, and she felt the warmth of it clear to her feet. He came in and stamped the dew from his boots. "You've a habit," he said, "of watching a man like you mean to buy him." "I'm only checking the goods are sound," she said. "The seller misrepresented the mare, so I've learned to be careful." That drew the laugh out of him, quiet and real, and he crossed the little room and stood near enough that she had to tip her chin up. For a moment neither of them spoke. The bread smell was thick and good around them, and somewhere out past the barn old Pete was cursing at a gate hinge, and the whole ordinary world went on turning while Caleb Rourke looked down at her with something in his face she had never once expected to be pointed at her. "Hannah," he said, and his voice had gone low, the way it went when he meant a thing all the way through. "I've been calling this a bargain since the day you stepped off that stage. Separate rooms and a trial season and no promises." He set his hat on the table, deliberate, as a man lays down a card he has been holding too long. "I'm done calling it that." Her breath stilled. "Caleb, let me get it said or I'll lose the nerve, and I've precious little to spare." He took her cup from her hands and set it aside, and then he took the hands themselves, rough thumb moving over her knuckles. "You're mine now if you'll have it. Not the sister I sent for, not a stand-in for anybody. You. I've wanted it plainer than I've let on, and I'm tired of standing at your door of a night and walking off like a coward." She had spent her whole life bracing for the other thing, the turning away, the second place, the door closing on the far side of somebody prettier. She did not know in that first instant what to do with a door opening. Her eyes stung, and she was furious at herself for it. "You needn't say pretty things to me," she said, unsteady. "I came knowing what I was." "I'm not saying pretty things. I never learned how." He bent, and his forehead came to rest against hers, and the whisper of it was warm against her mouth. "I'm saying true ones. You'll have to make do with those." "I've always preferred them," she managed, and then his lips found hers, careful and certain all at once, and Hannah Weaver, who had been packed onto a westbound train like a parcel nobody wanted, was, for the first time in her life, chosen and told so and kissed for it in a warm kitchen with the bread rising. She held to the front of his shirt as though the floor might tilt, and it rather felt as if it had. When they drew apart, he did not let go of her. "We'll do it proper," he said. "A real wedding, not a paper one. In the church if you like it, or under the cottonwood by the creek if you'd rather, and you'll wear whatever you please, and I'll not hear a word about plain. You'll choose it, all of it. First time in your life a thing gets chosen the way you want it." "You'll spoil me," she said. "That's the aim." Old Pete's delight, when he was told, took the form of a great deal of grumbling about how it was high time, and a man couldn't get a straight day's work with all this carrying on. Followed, when he thought no one watched, by his blowing his nose very hard into a red kerchief, and standing a long moment at the corral rail with his back to the house. Mrs. Abernathy, when Hannah went into town for thread and could not keep the news off her face, came around the counter of the mercantile and took Hannah's cheeks in both soft hands and said, "There now. Didn't I tell you? Didn't I say he looks at you?" and pressed a length of good ivory ribbon into her hands and would not take a cent for it. For 3 days Hannah lived in a happiness so unfamiliar she kept testing it the way a tongue tests a sore tooth, half expecting pain. They walked the creek at dusk and argued cheerfully over where a table might go and whether the guest bench ought to face the water. Caleb rode out each morning and came back each evening and stopped now at no door but hers. She began, cautiously, to believe. It was on the fourth day that the boy came up from the telegraph office with a folded paper and a curious look, and the sky, which had been so clear, seemed to Hannah to close over all at once. Caleb read it standing in the yard. She watched his jaw go tight before he spoke, and the old cold dread rose in her before she knew a single word. "It's from your family," he said. They're coming west." He looked up from the paper, and she saw him choosing his tone, gentling it for her. "Your mother, your father, and Delia." A pause. "The wire says she's reconsidered, that she means to come and set the matter right, it says." The world tipped, but not the good way it had tipped in the kitchen. Hannah stood very still on the swept ground she had come to think of as hers, and felt the ground turn borrowed under her feet. "Set it right," she repeated. The words tasted of every wedding morning she had watched from a doorway. "She's heard, then, that you're prosperous, that you're," she could not say devoted, it was too tender a thing to lay next to Delia's name. "She's heard something," Caleb said grimly, and she understood with a lurch that her own letter, the honest, glad, foolish letter she had sealed with such hope, had likely helped carry the tale. Somewhere, too, she thought of Silas Crane's oily sympathy, his sidelong interest, and wondered what a resentful man might put in an envelope. But it hardly mattered how the wolves had caught the scent. They had. They were coming. "Hannah," Caleb crossed to her and took her by the arms, and his eyes were steady as fence posts. "Look at me. It changes nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing. Let her come. Let the whole family come and bring the preacher, too. It changes not one thing that's been said between us." She wanted to believe him. She had never in her life wanted anything so badly. But belief was a muscle, and hers had been let waste from disuse, worn thin by 100 small demonstrations that Delia came first and Hannah came after, that a pretty face in a doorway rearranged every plan a family had made. She looked up into the face of the man who had kissed her in the kitchen, and she heard herself say, small and terrible, "You've never seen her, Caleb, not in the flesh. You paid for her face. You'll see it now." Something crossed his features, hurt maybe that she'd think it, but he did not let go of her. "I saw her likeness for months," he said. "It never once got up before dawn and set my house to rights. It never named the trouble in my mare's leg or corrected my ledgers when it thought I wasn't looking. A face doesn't do those things. You did. I know exactly what I've got hold of, and I'll not be talked loose of it by a woman I've never met, be she plain as a plank or fair as morning." It was the finest thing anyone had ever said to her. And still, this was the cruelty of a lifetime's teaching. A cold, small voice underneath it whispered, "That is what he thinks now," before she smiles at him, before she laughs the way she does, before your mother tells him with her eyes that you were only ever the useful one. Hannah nodded because he wanted her to, and she pressed her face to his chest so he could not see that the nod was a lie. And over his shoulder she watched the road that ran east toward the stage line and felt the crack open in her, thin and cold, between what he swore and what she could bring herself to trust. Caleb held her and felt the stiffness in her that had not been there at breakfast, and understood more than she gave him credit for. "Hannah," he said into her hair, "whatever's coming, you and I face it standing next to one another. Not you behind me and not you off to the side where you're used to standing. Beside me. Say it back." "Beside you," she said, and meant it, and did not believe it both at once. The stage was due Thursday. On Thursday, the whole of the little town seemed to have found reason to loiter near the depot, for word travels fast in thin country, and the notion that the plain weaver bride's beautiful sister had come to reclaim the rancher was a richer entertainment than any that had passed through in months. Hannah stood on the boardwalk in the good dress with Mrs. Abernathy's ivory ribbon at the collar, and her hands were quite cold, and Caleb stood at her side with his hat on and his face like weather about to break. The coach came in a rise of dust, the horses blowing, the driver hauling them down. The door swung, and Delia stepped out into the Montana light the way she had stepped into every room of Hannah's life, as though it had been waiting for her, as though the sun itself had been holding the pose. She was radiant. She was rested and gowned and gloved, and she paused on the step to be looked at, and was, and knew it. Behind her came Mother, mouth already arranging itself, and Father counting the fine barn and the good fences with a merchant's eye. And at the edge of the crowd, thumbs hooked in his vest, smiling like a man watching his own money come good, stood Silas Crane. Delia's gaze swept the boardwalk, found Caleb warmed. Then it found Hannah beside him, plain, ribboned, trembling, and something like pity or triumph curved her lovely mouth. "Why, Hannah," she said, sweet as poured cream, loud enough for all the street to hear. "Look at you. However did you manage all this while?" She came forward with her hands out, the very picture of a sister come to mend a family's honest mistake. "Well, I'm here now. We can put it all to rights." The reckoning had come, and Hannah felt the old floor of her life open up beneath the new one, and could not, for her heart, be sure which would hold. Chapter 7. The Beauty Reclaims Her Bargain. The morning after the stage arrived, Hannah rose before the light as she always had, because it was the only hour of the day that still belonged to her. She kneaded the bread with the same hands that had mended Delia's veil in another life, and she told herself that nothing was different, that the kitchen was still hers, that the sound of hooves and voices out in the yard meant nothing at all. But it meant everything, and she knew it. Delia came down the stair when the sun was well up, and she came down the way she came into every room, as though it had been built to receive her. She had slept in the good bed Caleb had insisted the guests be given, and she had risen looking as if she had slept in silk. Her traveling dress was pressed. Her curls were pinned. She paused in the doorway of the kitchen, took in the flour on Hannah's apron and the sweat at her temple, and she smiled the old smile, the one that meant she was about to be generous. "You've made yourself quite useful," Delia said. "You always did. Come sit. You mustn't wear yourself out on my account, not now that I'm here to set things right." "There's nothing to set right," Hannah said. She did not stop working the dough. "Isn't there?" Delia drifted to the window and looked out over the yard, over the corrals and the long roll of grass toward the mountains, and something hungry passed behind her lovely face. "It's a great deal grander than the letters made it sound. Mother said it would be a shack. It isn't a shack at all." She turned. "I've come to marry him, Hannah. As I was always meant to, you know that. You said he was a dirt rancher. You said you'd sooner die than come west." "I was a girl then," Delia laughed, light as a bell. "I've reconsidered. A woman's allowed to reconsider, especially when the man in question has been kind enough to wait." She crossed the room and laid a cool hand on Hannah's floured wrist, stopping it. "You've kept his house warm for me. That was good of you, but you can't have thought it would last." Out in the yard, Caleb was talking low with old Pete by the barn, his hat pushed back, his shoulders set in that still, unreadable way he had. Hannah watched him through the glass and felt the old thing settle into her chest like cold water finding its level. The certainty she had carried her whole life, that when the beautiful one wanted a thing, the plain one gave it up. "No," she said quietly, "I never thought it would last." Delia's smile softened into something almost tender, and that was the cruelest part of her, that she could believe herself kind while she took. "There, you see how easy it is when we're honest with each other." She lifted a curl back from her cheek and studied Hannah as though she were a hem that wanted straightening. "You might come to the wedding if you like. Stand up with me even." "Wouldn't that be sweet, the sister who kept the seat warm, giving me away to my own husband?" She laughed at her own wit and drifted toward the door, and at the threshold she paused. "He waited for me, Hannah. A man like that doesn't wait for a woman he'd rather have. Do try to remember that, and it'll go easier for you." Then she was gone, out into the sun, calling Caleb's name in her bright, carrying voice, and Hannah stood alone with the dough going slack under her stilled hands. Her mother and father made themselves at home by noon, and by noon her father had walked the property line and her mother had counted the linens, and both of them wore the pleased, proprietary look of people appraising an inheritance. They cornered her in the kitchen while Delia was off charming Caleb over the horses. Her mother sat at the table Hannah had scrubbed white, folded her hands, and spoke in the reasonable voice she used when she was about to ask for something unreasonable. "You've done a fine thing, Hannah, truly. When your sister balked, you stepped in, and you've held the arrangement together until she could see sense. No one will ever say you weren't dutiful." "Held it together," Hannah repeated. "The contract name's Delia," her father said. He said it the way he laid down a card he knew would take the trick. "The passage was bought in her name. The photograph," he answered, "was hers. In the eyes of anyone with sense, and in the eyes of the law besides, you are, forgive me, a stand-in. And a stand-in steps aside when the principal arrives. It's the natural order of the thing." "There's the family to think of," her mother said. "Delia's future. If she's cast off now after coming all this way, the shame of it will follow us home. You wouldn't do that to your sister. You've never been selfish, Hannah. It was always your best quality." Hannah looked at the two of them across the table she had made a home of, and she understood that they had not come west to see her at all. They had come to collect a thing she had accidentally made valuable. "And what becomes of me," she said, "when I step aside gracefully?" Her mother's smile did not falter. "You'll come home with us. There's always a place for you at home." There always had been. In the back, in the kitchen, invisible. Hannah turned back to the stove so they would not see her face, and she said nothing at all, which they took, as they always had, for agreement. "That's my sensible girl," her mother said, rising, satisfied, smoothing her skirts. "You'll see it's for the best. Delia was never meant for a life of drudgery, she'd wither at it. But you've a gift for hard places, Hannah. You always land on your feet because you never expected to land soft. It's a mercy in its way not to want much." Her father clapped her once on the shoulder as he passed, the nearest thing to affection he owned, and the two of them went out to inspect the smokehouse, already speaking of Delia's future as though it were a field they'd bought and meant to plant. Hannah stood over the stove until the trembling passed out of her hands. She had thought these last weeks that she had become someone new out here, someone chosen, someone first. It had taken her parents less than a day to fold her back into the old shape. That was the thing about the old shape. It fit. Silas Crane rode over that afternoon under the flag of neighborly welcome, and he brought a bottle of something good for the men and a great deal of oiled sympathy for everyone. Hannah heard him on the porch with her father, their voices dropping the way men's voices drop when the talk turns to business dressed as kindness. "A regrettable muddle, the whole affair," Crane was saying, "but easily mended with goodwill on all sides. Your girl, the handsome one, she's clearly the intended party. Rourke's a stubborn man, but he's fair, and he'll see the sense of honoring the paper as it was written. It only wants smoothing." A pause, the clink of a glass. "I've some standing hereabouts. I'd be glad to smooth it, neighbor to neighbor." "And in exchange," her father, who understood a bargain when he heard one. "Rourke and I have a small disagreement over a creek that runs both our ways. A trifle. Once your daughter's settled here as she ought to be, I'd count on the new family's friendship to see the water shared out reasonable. That's all. A friend on that land instead of a stubborn widower, it'd be worth a great deal to me." Hannah stood very still on the other side of the door and felt the shape of it come clear. The two of them braiding their wants together, her sister the excuse and the creek the prize, and herself the loose thread to be pulled out and thrown away so the weave would lie flat. She had spent her whole life being useful. She had not understood, until that porch, how useful a person could be to people who meant to be rid of her. She found Caleb at the corral fence at dusk, watching the lame mare he'd once told her he was going to shoot before Hannah named the fix and saved her leg. The mare grazed easy now, sound and unbothered, and he stood watching her as though he'd forgotten she was ever going to die. Delia had been at him all day. Hannah knew the look of a man Delia had been working on, the faint distraction, the way she got inside a person's certainty and moved the furniture around. Delia would have reminded him, gently, that he'd chosen her, that he'd paid for her, that every promise he made had been made to her face in a photograph, and that the woman standing beside him at the fence was only the shadow that had come in the beauty's place. "They want me to step aside," Hannah said. She had decided to say it plainly. She was too tired for anything else. "My family, Delia. They've come to put things back the way the paper says they ought to be." Caleb didn't answer at once. He put his hand out and the mare came to it, and he stood a long moment with his palm on the animal's nose. "The contract does name her," he said. That was all. 4 words low, spoken to the mare more than to Hannah, and then he went quiet in that stone way of his, the way he'd gone quiet with Crane over the strayed cattle, the way a man goes quiet when he's already decided something and won't be moved off it. Hannah waited for the rest. She waited for him to turn and take her face in his hands the way he had by the dying fire, to say the thing he'd whispered only days ago, "You're mine now, if you'll have it." She waited for him to look at her. He kept his eyes on the horse, and the old lesson closed over her like water over a stone. She had heard those 4 words her whole life in 100 different rooms. The contract names her. The passage was hers. She was always meant to. The plain one had had her little season of being needed, and now the beautiful one had come, and the man had gone quiet, and quiet was the sound the world made when it was choosing against her. "I see," Hannah said. She did not. She had heard the front half of a sentence and none of the back of it, and she did not stay to learn that Caleb Rourke, who valued a straight word over a pretty one, was working out how to say the truest one he'd ever spoken. She only saw the set of his shoulders and the way he wouldn't look at her, and she turned before he could see what her face was doing. Behind her, Caleb finally lifted his head. "Hannah." But she was already walking toward the house, quick and straight-backed, the way a person walks when they are holding themselves together by main strength and cannot afford to be stopped. "The contract does name her," he said again, to her back this time, "which is why I mean to ride to town in the morning and be rid of the cursed thing entire. I'll not have a scrap of paper in the world with the wrong sister's name on what's mine." But the evening wind had come up off the mountains, and it took the words the way it took the dust, and Hannah did not hear them. She heard only the door and her own footsteps, and the low, triumphant laugh of her sister waiting in the lit kitchen, the beautiful one, come at last to reclaim her bargain, and certain as Hannah was now that she had already won. Chapter 8, the second best again. Hannah folded the blue dress last, the one Caleb had bought her without a word the morning of the town social, and she did it slowly, the way a person handles a thing they mean never to touch again. The carpet-bag was the same one she had carried west. That struck her as a cruel kind of tidiness. She had come with it half empty, braced to be sent home before the dust settled on her boots, and now she would leave with it half empty again, having in between filled a whole house and, foolishly, a whole heart. The house would keep, the heart she would have to learn to empty on the road. She had heard him. That was the thing she could not step around, no matter how many times she circled it. She had stood in the hall with a basket of mending on her hip and heard Caleb's low voice through the parlor door, even and certain the way it always was when he had made up his mind. The contract does name her. 4 words. She had not needed to hear the rest. She had spent her whole life learning to read the moment a room turned against her, and she had read it then, in a single breath, and set the mending down on the stair so she would not drop it. Downstairs, Delia was laughing. The sound carried up through the floorboards, bright and easy, the laugh of a woman who had never once wondered whether she was wanted. It had always come easy to Delia, the laughing, the being chosen. Hannah pressed the blue dress flat and told herself it was only right. Water ran downhill. The pretty sister got the pretty life. She had known that before she could spell her own name. She let herself remember, because refusing to had never kept the memories out. She remembered being 9 and standing at the edge of a birthday she'd thought was partly hers, watching the neighbor children crowd Delia. Remembered her mother's hand steering her toward the kitchen, "You're such a help, Hannah," as though usefulness were the prize and not the consolation. She remembered mending the wedding veil with her own careful stitches, so that Delia might wear it to marry the man Hannah was now packing to leave. She had sewn that veil in the gray farmhouse light, and never once let herself think the word unfair, because unfair was a word for people who believed they'd been owed something in the first place. She remembered, too, the winter she'd taken the fever and lain 3 days burning while the house went on around her, her mother's worry spent instead on Delia's chilblains. Remembered learning, small and hot with sickness, that a girl could be present in a house and absent from its care in the same breath. She had folded that lesson away with all the others and carried it west, and out here, for one bright borrowed season, she had let herself forget she owned it. She had let herself believe it here. That was her mistake, and she named it plainly, the way Caleb had taught her without ever meaning to. She had believed the mud-streaked nights and the low talk by the fire and the way he'd wiped her cheek with his thumb and called her the one they should never have been ashamed of. She had believed "You're mine now, if you'll have it," whispered against her hair not a week past. She had let a lifetime of hard sense go soft, and this was the bill come due. "Borrowed," she said to the empty room, testing the word. "It was borrowed, it was never yours." Saying it aloud was supposed to help. It did not, but she buckled the bag. She would not be set aside in front of them. That much she could still choose. She would not stand in the parlor and let her mother explain in that gentle, martyred voice that it was best for everyone if Hannah stepped down graciously. Would not watch Delia arrange her face into sympathy while Crane looked on from the doorway with the patience of a man who has bet on a sure thing. She had been discarded once on a train platform with "Do try not to embarrass us" for a farewell. She would not stand still and let it happen a second time. She would leave first. It was a small sovereignty, the only one left to her, and she took it. She went out by the kitchen, so she would not have to pass the parlor. Mrs. Abernathy was there, of all people, unpacking a basket of preserves onto the table she'd been invited to fill for the family's welcome. She turned, and her round face went from cheer to alarm in the space of a heartbeat, reading the bag in Hannah's hand the way one reads a telegram edged in black. "Now," she said, "now you put that down." "I can't," Hannah said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd feared. "I only came to say I'm grateful. You were the first friend I had out here, likely the truest." She made herself smile. "You'll look in on him. He forgets to eat when the herd's troubling him, and old Pete will tell you he's fine when he isn't." "Hannah Weaver," Mrs. Abernathy set down a jar hard enough to ring. "Whatever you think you heard." "I didn't think it, I heard it." She said it kindly, because none of this was the older woman's doing. "It's all right. It's how it's always been. I'd rather go while I can still hold my head up than be handed my coat in front of my sister." She kissed the woman's cheek before she could argue further, and went out into the yard, where the light was already going long and gold across the paddocks, and old Pete was leading the lame mare in from the near field. He saw the bag before she'd crossed half the distance, and he dropped the lead line where he stood. "No," he said, "no, you don't. Pete, you listen to me?" He came at her fast for an old man, planting himself square in her path, and his weathered face was working with something she had never seen on it, not gruffness, but real fear. "Where do you think you're walking, to?" "The stage road. I'll wait at the Abernathy place for the morning coach." She tried to step around him. He moved with her. "Pete, don't make this harder. He's in there deciding, and I'll not be here for the verdict." "Deciding?" Pete said the word like it tasted foul. "Girl, he ain't in that house. He rode out at first light, and he ain't come back." Hannah stopped. Delia said he was in the parlor. I heard." "You heard whatever that snake and them people wanted you to hear is what you heard." Pete's jaw jumped. "Caleb Rourke has been down at the county seat since dawn, left before your sister was out of bed, told me keep the house standin' and don't let nobody sign nothin'. Road ranger 'cause he wanted the fast horse, and a man don't take the fast horse for a Sunday errand." He jabbed a knotted finger toward the road. "Whatever you think you know, you got it by half." Something in Hannah's chest turned over, painful and unwilling to hope. She had spent too long teaching herself not to. "Then what's he doing there?" she said, and hated how small it came out. She could not have answered it, standing in that yard. But it was being answered, 30 miles off, in a low brick office that smelled of ink and dust, where Caleb Rourke stood at a clerk's counter with his hat in his hand and his patience worn to the grain. He had the original contract spread flat under his palm, the paper the Weavers had signed, the one that named Delia in a copperplate hand, the one Crane had smiled about the way a man smiles when he thinks he holds the winning card. Caleb had read that clause a dozen times since the family stepped off the stage. It does name her. He had said as much aloud to the lawyer that morning, turning the trap over in the daylight so he could see the shape of it whole. And then he had asked what a man had to do to make a piece of paper mean nothing at all. "You're certain," the clerk said, dipping his pen. "Once it's voided, it's voided. No going back on it." "I never wanted to go back on anything in my life," Caleb said, "as bad as I want to go back on this." He signed his name across the old contract where it canceled the thing entire, and he watched the ink dry, and it was the first easy breath he'd drawn since the telegram came. Then he laid down the deed and asked the clerk to enter the water parcel free and clear against any claim Silas Crane meant to bring. And last of all, he took up the fresh license, the marriage license, blank and waiting. And he watched the clerk write, in that same careful copperplate, the name Hannah Weaver. He did not know, bent over that counter, that his errand was already understood by everyone but the one it was for. Back at the ranch, in Caleb's absence, Silas Crane was making his move. Hannah did not hear it. She was still in the yard, Pete's hand now gripping her arm, the two of them arguing in low, urgent voices. But Delia came out onto the porch to find her, because Delia had never in her life been able to leave a victory unspoken. "You're going," Delia said, and she did not trouble to hide her satisfaction. She looked lovely in the gold light, as she always did. Loveliness had never cost her a thing. "Mother thought you might make a scene. I told her you wouldn't. You've always known your place, Hannah. I'll say that for you." She came down a step. "You must see how it was always going to end. He paid for me. Men pay for the picture, not the girl who does the mending. It was never going to be you." She tilted her head almost gentle. "You never stood a chance." And the terrible thing, the thing that shamed Hannah even as it broke her, was that a lifetime rose up to agree. "Let go, Pete," she said quietly. "Girl, let go." She loosened his fingers herself, one at a time, because if she looked at his stricken face a moment longer she would weep, and she would not do that here, not with Delia watching. Tell him, her voice failed. She started again. Don't tell him anything, let him have the easy road for once. He's earned it. She took up the carpet bag and walked out past the paddock, past the garden plot she had staked with her own hands, out onto the stage road with the dusk coming down purple over the mountains and the ranch settling small and lamplit behind her. She had lost. She was as sure of it as she had ever been sure of anything, and being sure was the one thing she had always been good at. The road ran gray and empty ahead. She fixed her eyes on it and made herself walk, and she did not let herself look back at the lights, because looking back was for people who believed there was something behind them to return to. She had gone perhaps a quarter-mile when she heard it, under the wind, under her own held breath, the sound of a horse ridden hard and fast in the failing light, hoofbeats rising on the road behind her, coming on and coming closer. Chapter 9, The Whispered Claim. The road out of the valley ran gray in the failing light, and Hannah walked it with her carpetbag knocking against her knee and her eyes fixed on the ruts ahead, because if she looked at anything else, the fence line she had helped mend, the far blue shoulder of the mountains that had come, God help her, to feel like home, she would not be able to keep walking. So she watched the road. She counted her steps the way she had counted them as a girl climbing the stairs past Delia's lamplit door, and she told herself the same old thing. This was never yours. You only borrowed it. The hoofbeats came up behind her fast, and she did not turn. She had spent a lifetime not turning around for people who were not coming for her. Hannah, his voice cracked the dusk open. Hannah Weaver, you stop right there. She stopped. She did not turn. She heard the horse blow and stamp, heard the creak of leather and the heavy sound of a big man coming down out of the saddle too quick, and then Caleb Rourke was in front of her, hatless, his chest heaving, dust to the knee and something wild in his face she had never seen there. Caleb, who was always still. Caleb, whose word was law because he never spent it carelessly, standing in the middle of the road, breathing like he'd run the whole distance himself. "Where do you think you're going?" he said. It was not a question. Home, the word tasted like ash. Back east. Before, she lifted her chin, and she was proud of how level she kept it. "Before you have to do it out loud, I'll spare us both that. The contract name's Delia. I heard you say it." Something moved across his face then, not anger, not quite. Understanding, arriving all at once and horrifying him. "You heard me say the contract name's Delia," he repeated slowly. "In the parlor, to the county man's letter. I wasn't listening at doors, I only—" Her voice betrayed her, thinned, and she hated it. "I only heard that much. And you filled in the rest yourself." He said it very quietly. "The way you always do, you heard half of it and you gave yourself the ending you've been taught to expect." "Don't," she pressed the word out between her teeth. "Don't you make it small. It's not a foolishness, Caleb, it's my whole life. They dressed me and put me on a train in her place because I was good for something at last. She came back because your ranch turned out to be worth having. And the paper has her name on it, not mine, and everyone in that house is waiting for the plain one to have the grace to disappear. I'm only saving myself the walk out the front door with all of them watching." For a moment he said nothing. The wind came down off the hills and moved the grass on both sides of the road, and the horse cropped at it, unconcerned, and Hannah stood there with her heart breaking in an orderly, familiar way, because she had had a lot of practice. Then Caleb reached inside his coat and took out a folded paper, and another folded with it, and he held them out to her in the dying light. "Read it," he said. "Caleb, you want to talk about what a paper says. Read the paper." Her hands were not steady. She set the carpetbag down in the dust and took them. The first was the old contract. She knew it by the crease of it. The arrangement made between Sela's Crane's smooth intercession and her father's greed and a rancher who had once, sight unseen, agreed to marry a photograph named Delia Weaver. Across the whole of it, corner to corner, in ink still black and new, was drawn a single hard line, and beneath it in the county clerk's crabbed hand, "Void by mutual release. Filed this day." And Caleb's signature under that, pressed so hard the pen had nearly gone through. The second paper she could not read at all for a moment. The letters swam. She blinked them still. It was a license, fresh from the county office, and where a name ought to be, it said, in that same official hand, Hannah Weaver. "I rode to town this morning," Caleb said, "to tear up the thing that named your sister and to make the true one in its place." I have been gone all day getting the deed and the license set right so that no man, not Crane, not your father, not the law itself, could ever again stand in my parlor and tell me which weaver I am bound to. And I come home to find you gone up the road with your bag." His voice went rough. "You'd have had me chase a train clear to the Mississippi, woman." "I don't," she was shaking now, the two papers trembling in her hands, void and license, the end of one thing and the beginning of another she had not let herself want. "You did this before you knew I heard, before any of it." "I did it the morning she stepped off the stage." He took a step toward her. "I did it because there was never a question in my mind to answer. You've been so busy expecting to be sent away, you never once considered I'd already made up mine to keep you." She looked up at him, and the last of her defenses, the ones she had been building brick on brick since she was 6 years old and learned to be useful because she could not be lovely, came down all at once. And it hurt more than any of it, more than the leaving, because hope always did. "Come back with me," Caleb said. "Not to disappear, to be seen. Let them look at you standing exactly where you belong, and let me say what I've got to say with all of them there to hear it. You've been talked over your whole life. I mean to talk you into it in front of every last one of them." He held out his hand. "Come home, Hannah." She picked up her carpet bag. She put her hand in his. It was, she thought, the first time in her life she had ever turned around because someone had, in fact, come. The parlor was full and bright and wrong when they came in together, Caleb still dusty, Hannah's chin high and her hand fast in his. Delia stood at the center of it in her traveling silk, radiant, arranged mid-sentence, and the sentence died. Mother and father sat stiff by the cold hearth, and Silas Crane leaned by the window with the ease of a man watching a thing go the way he'd paid for it to go, until he saw their joined hands, and the ease drained out of him. "Caleb," Delia began, recovering, gliding forward with her lovely smile. "There you are. We've had such a muddle, but it's all being put right now, the contract." "The contract's void." Caleb did not raise his voice. He never had to. He crossed to the table and laid the two papers down on it, side by side, and put one blunt finger on the first. "Signed and filed this morning. There is no arrangement naming Delia Weaver. There is no bargain for anyone in this room to reclaim." He moved his finger to the second paper. "And there is a license. It has one name on it." He looked at her father when he said it. "It is not the name you sent." Nobody spoke. The fire ticked in the grate. Then Caleb turned, and he crossed the room to Hannah, and he took her face in both his rough hands, gentle, so gentle, the way a man handles the one thing he is afraid to break, and he tilted it up to his, and though the whole room strained to hear, he spoke low, as if it were only for her, which was how she knew every word of it was true. "Your people," he said softly, "sent me the wrong sister to be ashamed of." His thumb moved once along her cheek. "They were wrong about which one. There is not a thing about you to be ashamed of, Hannah, and there is not a day I've had you under my roof I haven't thanked whatever fool luck put you on that train. I didn't settle. Hear me. Men settle when they can't get what they want. I got exactly what I wanted the moment you told me the truth on a public street with everyone waiting to see me send you back." His voice dropped further to almost nothing, and she felt it more than heard it. "You are not second to anyone under this roof. Not to her, not to a memory, not ever. It was always going to be you." The words went into her like warmth into cold hands, painful and perfect, and Hannah, who had been braced her whole life against a rejection, found she had no armor at all against being chosen, and the tears came, and for once in her life she did not fight them down to keep from being a bother. Then Caleb straightened, and the gentleness went out of his voice, and he turned it on the room. "Crane," Silas came off the window frame. "You rode east to bring these people here, and you did it so that while I was busy defending my marriage, you might quietly walk off with the creek land your sympathy was always angling for. Old Pete rode the county line this week. I know where your fences have crept." His voice was iron now. "The deed's filed same as the rest. You'll not have my water, and you'll not have my house to meddle in. Get off my ranch and don't test whether my word about you carries in this town. It carries further than yours." Crane looked once around the parlor for an ally and found none, not even in the Weavers, and he took his hat and went, and the door shut on him, and that was the end of that. Caleb turned last to Delia, and here his voice was not cruel, only plain, which was worse. "You came back because the ranch was worth having, I understand it, but beauty was never the thing I lacked, Miss Weaver. I lacked a true heart in my house." He glanced at Hannah, and his hard face eased. "I've got one now. You couldn't have given me that. You'd have had to own one first." Delia's mouth opened and shut. For once, no charm came to her rescue. It was Hannah's mother who broke the silence, in a small, strange voice, looking at her younger daughter as though seeing her for the first time across all the years. "Hannah," she said. We did not," she could not finish. But it was, in its clumsy incompleteness, the nearest thing to an apology Hannah had ever been given, and she found she did not need it to be more than it was. Caleb turned back to her. "Well," he said, quieter again, just theirs. "I've said my piece in front of God and everybody. The paper's got your name, but it hasn't got your yes yet, and I'll not have that arranged either. So I'm asking, Hannah, on my own account and yours, will you have me?" And Hannah Weaver, who had come west to be sent home, who had spent her whole life being chosen last or not at all, looked up at the man who had ridden the road to bring her back and said her yes. Not because she had nowhere else to go, not because she was useful, but because for the first time she was choosing, too. "Yes," she said, "on my own account." "Yes." Chapter 10, first, not second. The morning of the true wedding broke clear and gold over the Rourke Ranch, and for the first time in her life, Hannah Weaver woke certain of her welcome. She lay a moment in the gray light before dawn, listening to the house that was hers, not borrowed, not held on trial, hers. The stove ticked as old Pete, who had appointed himself to the fire this once, coaxed it into life below, and the smell of coffee crept up the stairs like a friend come early. Outside, wagons were already turning off the county road. She could hear the creak and jangle of them and voices calling greetings across the yard. The whole valley, it seemed, was coming to see the Plain sister married in earnest. There would be no train hurrying her toward a stranger this time. No veil mended for someone else. This dress was her own, sewn these 3 weeks by her own hands and Mrs. Abernathy's, a soft blue that the mercantile keeper swore made Hannah's eyes look like weather worth watching. "Hold still, child," Mrs. Abernathy said now, pinning the last of Hannah's hair, her plump face already wet. "I promised myself I'd not weep before the vows, and here I've gone and broke it in the bedroom where no one can even admire the sentiment." "You may weep as much as you like," Hannah said, and found she was smiling. "I've cried enough alone. It's a fine change to have company for the happy kind." Mrs. Abernathy laughed and dabbed her eyes with a corner of her apron. "He's been down at that altar since before I got here. Stood there like a fence post, won't sit, won't be talked to. Old Pete says he hasn't seen the man so rattled since the spring flood." She squeezed Hannah's shoulders. "That, my dear, is what it looks like when a man's afraid the good thing will slip his grip. You go on and put him out of his misery." They had built the altar of planed pine beneath the big cottonwood by the creek, the very creek Sela's crane had schemed a year to steal. Hannah thought of that as old Pete offered her his crooked arm at the top of the yard, scrubbed pink and near strangled by a collar he plainly resented. "I ain't her father," he muttered low so only she could hear, "nor any kin to speak of. But that man over yonder is the nearest thing I got to a son, and I reckon that makes you the nearest thing I got to a daughter, so I'll walk you down and no arguing on it." "I wouldn't dream of arguing, Pete," Hannah said, and pressed his weathered hand where it lay in the crook of her arm. "There's no one I'd rather have." He grunted, which she had learned was how the old man kept from weeping himself, and they started down through the gathered crowd. They had all come. The Hendersons and the Doyles, the schoolteacher and the smith, the very women who had murmured a year ago that Rourke got the plain one. They rose as she passed, and there was not one smirk among them now, only the soft, astonished warmth of a town watching a thing come right, because it had come right. She had made it so, one loaf and one mended ledger and one steady night in the mud at a time, until the valley had stopped seeing the sister who was sent and started seeing the woman who had stayed. And at the end of it all stood Caleb. He had shaved close and put on his one good coat, and he looked, as Pete had promised, like a man barely holding still. But when he saw her, when he truly saw her coming down through the light with the creek shining behind, every hard-worn line of him eased, the way a held breath eases, and his gray eyes went bright in a manner she had never once seen in all the passing over years of her girlhood. He was looking at her as though she were the only thing in the valley worth the looking. The parson said his words, and Hannah heard perhaps half of them. She was watching Caleb's face, and he was watching hers, and when it came time for the vows he took both her hands in his rough ones and held them like something a man would not risk dropping. "I, Caleb, take you, Hannah," he said, and his voice did not waver. "Not in place of any other, not second to a soul living or dead, first and chosen and mine to keep for all my days." She had not known those words were coming. They were not the parson's. They were his own, laid down plain before the whole town as he'd laid down the license a week past. And at the sound of them, the last small, frightened thing that had lived in her chest since childhood simply let go and was gone. "I Hannah take you, Caleb," she answered, steady as she'd learned to be from him. "Not because I was sent. Because I'd choose this ground, and this man over any easy road on earth." When he kissed her, the valley cheered fit to scatter the cattle, and old Pete blew his nose like a bugle, and Mrs. Abernathy gave up weeping quietly altogether. Her family had come to the wedding after all, though they stood apart at the edge of it, chastened as she had never seen them. Delia found her in the quiet after, when the tables were being laid with the whole town's cooking, and Caleb had been dragged off to be pounded on the back by every man who owned a hat. She came in a traveling dress, plainer than her wont, her radiance gone somehow thin in this open country that had never once bent to admire it. "We leave on the noon stage," Delia said. There was no charm in it now, no performance. "Mother thought we thought you'd want to know." Hannah studied her sister. A year ago the sight of Delia in a doorway had been enough to make her small. Now she only felt the strange, soft pity a person feels for a thing that has learned, too late, that it was never as large as it believed. "I'm glad you came," Hannah said, and meant it. "Whatever brought you?" Delia's mouth trembled. "He never even looked at me, not once the whole time. I kept waiting for it. I've always been able to make them look." She gave a small, broken laugh. "You were always the useful one. I thought that was the lesser thing. I thought being wanted for what a man could see was the prize." "It isn't," Hannah said gently. "Being wanted for what a man comes to know, that's the prize, Delia. I hope you find it." "I truly do." Her mother and father lingered by the wagon, and here was the harder thing, the thing Hannah had rehearsed and dreaded. But when she went to them, her father's eyes were wet, and her mother's proud chin was low. "We did you a wrong," her father said, rough with it. "Sent you off like goods we couldn't sell, and you went and built the finest thing any of us has ever stood in." He looked at the ranch, the cottonwood, the tables groaning with food, and the man laughing in the midst of it all. "I don't know that you can forgive it." "I can," Hannah said, and she found to her own quiet wonder that it was true. "I forgive it. But I'll not pretend it didn't happen, and I'll not be that girl again to make it easier on you. I'm not the daughter you overlooked. I'm the woman he chose. You may love me as I am now or not at all, but I'll not shrink back down to fit your old ideas of me." Her mother reached out then, hesitant, and touched Hannah's cheek, the first tenderness Hannah could remember from her hand. "You look happy," her mother whispered, as though it were a marvel she had no words to measure. "You look first." "I am," Hannah said. And though she did not say the rest aloud, she thought it plainly and without bitterness. It took a stranger 1,000 miles from home to see in a week what you never saw in 20 years. That was a grief, and she let it be one. But it was an old grief now, and she found she could set it down at last and walk on lighter for the leaving of it. They departed on the noon stage, humbled and small against the great open sky, and Crane was not with them. He had gone the week before, run off Caleb's land with his water scheme laid bare before the county recorder, the disputed creek deeded plain and forever into the Rourke name. The neighbors' smooth threats had come to nothing. The ranch's future sat as solid now as the mountains behind it. Hannah watched the stage dwindle down the road and felt no triumph, only a clean and settled peace, like a field after the last of the harvest is safely in. The party ran until the stars came out, and then the town went home in a long ribbon of lantern light, and the ranch was theirs and quiet again. Hannah stood at the window of the front room, her home, every board of it dear to her now, and watched the last wagon lose itself in the dark. Caleb came up behind her and set his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back into him the way she had once not dared to hope she might ever lean into anyone. "Tired?" he murmured against her hair. "A good tired?" She turned in the circle of his arms to face him. "I keep thinking of the girl who got on that train. She was so sure she'd be sent back before the week was out. She packed light so it wouldn't hurt as much being unpacked and turned around." Caleb was quiet a moment, his thumb moving slow across her jaw. "I keep thinking of the man who waited at that stage stop," he said. Fool that he was with a photograph in his pocket, thinking he knew what he wanted. He shook his head. "I paid for a face, Hannah, and God, in what mercy I'll never deserve, sent me a whole heart instead." They stood by the low fire, and he took her face in both his hands the way he had on the road that dusk when the hoofbeats came up behind her and everything turned. His gray eyes held hers, steady as his given word, which she had learned was the surest thing the man owned. "I told you it was always going to be you," he said low only for her. "I'll tell you now what I didn't say then. If there were 100 lives to live, and every one of them laid out with all the beautiful, easy choices a man could want, I'd walk past every one of them. I'd take the wrong sister off the train in the dust and the disappointment, and I'd count myself the luckiest fool between here and the ocean. Every life, every time. You've my word on it, and my word's the surest thing I've got to give." Hannah, who had spent a lifetime bracing to be second, looked up into the face of the one heart that had ever put her first, and found nothing left to brace against. "Then I'll hold you to it," she whispered. "Every life, every time." Outside, the wind moved soft through the cottonwood by the safe and settled creek. And inside, first at last in the place that was truly hers, the plain sister who came in another's stead laid her head against her husband's chest, and was, from that night forward, home.